welcome to the Columbine Health System Center for Healthy Aging's May Healthy Aging Speaker Series. My name is Allie, and I'm the admin at the center. I'll be your host for today's presentation with Dr. Gloria Luong, titled For Better or for Worse, Social and Emotional Development Across Adulthood. The Center for Healthy Aging at CSU serves as a catalyst for interdisciplinary research, evidence-based outreach, and education about healthy aging. So we appreciate you joining us to learn about the great research happening in the aging field. If you'd like to participate in future speaker series, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our presenter. Please be sure to mute your microphones so any background noise can be reduced. There should be time after the presentation for Q&A, and you're welcome to either unmute yourself and ask your question or type it in the chat. Also, we are recording this talk so you can view it again or forward the link to friends, family, and colleagues. It will also be available on the center's website along with the rest of the series. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Luong. Dr. Gloria Luong earned her PhD in psychology and social behavior with a concentration in developmental psychology from the University of California, Irvine, and her bachelor's in psychology with a minor in statistics from the University of California, Riverside. Before joining the faculty at CSU in 2015, Dr. Luong trained as a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, Germany, from 2012 to 2015. Dr. Luong is also the director of the Health, Emotion, and Aging Research Team, also called HEART, which focuses on how stressors influence health and well-being and how the processes may change across adulthood. Dr. Luong is currently an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. Thank you, Dr. Luong. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Allie. That was really nice of you. And so good afternoon to everyone. I think I also see some German friends and colleagues, so guten Abend to you as well. So I'm really excited to be able to share some work with you today. And as I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking a lot about stress. I think that's on a lot of our minds as of late. And, here, we've just wrapped up our semester, and I'm not sure about the rest of you, but this was a really challenging and stressful semester for me. And as I thought more about what we've gone through over the past years with the pandemic and, the economic situation, job insecurity, inflation, and, political unrest, a lot of things have been happening. And I found this tweet that I just felt was really apt and really kind of summarized what we've gone through over the past 2 years. So the tweet is, just imagine your 2019 self trying to make sense of this tweet being, Wordle is the sourdough starter of Omicron. And just to kind of break that down a little bit, as you know, when we had stay-at-home orders, a lot of people picked up new hobbies and tried to find different ways to cope with that stressful situation. Some people made sourdough bread. And with each new variant, like Omicron coming out, people have found different ways to preoccupy themselves, Wordle being a word game that people have been playing as of late. And we know that the pandemic has really had a toll on our physical health, but also our mental health. And recent studies are starting to emerge that suggest that things like loneliness, the prevalence of loneliness has increased in many countries across the world, especially in the US and in Europe. We're also seeing increases in mental health issues like greater depressive symptoms and anxiety. And the need and demand for mental health services has also gone up. And yet, maybe unsurprisingly, not everybody has been affected by the pandemic in the same ways. We have seen that some people have shown greater resilience and have been less affected by the pandemic. But maybe what has been surprising is that the age group that a lot of people thought would be most affected, that is older adults, were not the ones who were showing the negative effects that we thought we would see. So older adults show the greatest vulnerabilities, at least physically and physiologically, in terms of contracting the virus, showing longer term health complications, and even dying. And yet we see that it's not the older age group that is showing high and elevated levels of loneliness, depression, and anxiety, at least not across the board. And in fact, it tends to be at least based on studies that are starting to come out, it seems like it's the adolescents and younger adults who seem to be suffering more from these kinds of issues. And so this really leads to some surprising findings, but it's also highlighted just how important it is to understand stress and the ways that stress influences both our mental and our physical health. It leads us to question some of the stereotypes that we've been seeing in the media, in movies and TV shows, things like the grumpy old man or grumpy grandparent stereotype. Is it the case that, we tend to think of older age as a time when it's doom and gloom, everything goes downhill, our bodies are not working the way they used to, our memory isn't what it was, and maybe we're more depressed and lonely. And yet this is in contrast to other media images that suggest that maybe these are the golden years. This is the time of our lives when maybe we don't care as much what other people think. We're more satisfied with our lives. We find more meaning. And maybe we are surrounded by a strong social network that we care a lot about. I think to better understand these two contrasting views about what aging holds for us, especially as it comes to social and emotional experiences, I think we need to better understand the ways that stress might influence us and how it, quote unquote, gets under the skin. So one way to think about this is through an idea called affective reactivity. I know it's a mouthful, so I'll break it down for you. Imagine that we can track two people over the course of their day, and at any given moment, we know exactly how they're feeling. So on the y-axis here, we see negative affect. That represents negative emotions, things like how angry people are feeling, frustrated, sad, anxious. And imagine that we track person A and person B over the course of a day. And so those lines just represent, their fluctuations in their emotions. Higher levels indicate more of these negative emotions. So we can see that person B, on average, that dotted line representing their average, is higher than person A's average. And this, we know, is a risk factor. People who tend to experience more frequent and intense negative emotions also tend to have poor physical and mental health. And that's probably a little bit unsurprising. But if we were to contextualize these emotions, that is, if we're to better understand what is happening in people's lives and what's going on with them, let's imagine that for these two people, we're tracking them over the day, and we know that they're experiencing something stressful in that particular moment. Let's say they have to take an exam, or maybe they have a stressful work presentation. We can see now that if we compare person A in the red to person B and how much they're increasing in their negative emotions relative to their baseline levels, we can see that person A is more reactive. And we call that affective reactivity, or sometimes stress reactivity. And how reactive we become, how large that magnitude is, that too also predicts really important health outcomes. Things like up to 10 years later, do we develop chronic health conditions like diabetes? Or 10 years later, do we develop mental health issues like depression and anxiety? It even predicts things like our mortality risk. When do we die? So people who are more reactive tend to have poorer health. And so we can also see affective reactivity as an indicator of health. And so based on everything that I've told you so far, you might be wondering, okay, so as I age, am I going to become more reactive to stressors or less reactive? Based on what I told you about the pandemic, you might guess that maybe as we age, we're less reactive. In this table, what I'm showing you here on the left side, all those red studies in the column. So these are different authors who have found that as we get older, we're more reactive. And on the right side, in the green column, we can see a set of studies that show the opposite pattern, that as we get older, we're actually less reactive. So we show a smaller blip in our negative emotions. And of course, all those studies on the very bottom in the white text, or in the white space, that is a set of studies that show no differences between younger and older people. So these findings would suggest, gosh, we really don't know what's happening as we get older. And you might notice that my last name, I'm a co-author on studies on both sides. So it might suggest that, gosh, we really don't know what we're doing here, and we really don't know what's happening with aging. And I remember that as a graduate student and as a postdoc, looking at these findings, it was very puzzling to me. But as you dig deeper and you try to understand why might this be the case, we find that the studies on the left side tend to be ones in which they purposely stressed people out. So they brought them into the lab and made them do some kind of stressful task, like maybe put their hand into a bucket of ice cold water. Or they studied people in terms of general stressors they were experiencing, things like getting a flat tire or dealing with work deadlines. In contrast, on the right side, those are studies that suggest that, well, when older people have to deal with interpersonal stressors, that is, social stressors that have to do with other people. So this might be things like getting into arguments or disagreements or conflict situations with other people. Now we see an age-related advantage. Older people react less strongly in those cases compared to younger adults. Now you might be wondering, what is so special about those interpersonal stressors? Well, I would say if you were to put, if you want more bang for your buck and you wanted to sort of put all your marbles into one bucket, if you will, interpersonal stressors are the way to go. And the reason for that is they are one of the most frequent and distressing daily experiences that we can have. That is, they occur very often in our daily lives. And people report that these are among the most potent kinds of daily stressors that they deal with that have a greater influence on their health. And what's interesting about this is we're finding that older adults tend to report fewer of these potent stressors in general compared to younger adults. And when I say younger adults, I tend to refer to people who are between about 18 and 35. And when I say older adults, I'm talking about people who are older than 60 years old typically. And so what we see is that not only are they reporting fewer of these stressors, but when people get the sense that some kind of conflict might be brewing and that something stressful might be happening, older adults are also more adept. They're better at avoiding these kinds of stressful situations and or sort of massaging the situation in a way in which they're able to maintain greater social harmony. And this is really important because it suggests to us that older people might have gained some experiences, maybe some wisdom in dealing with these situations. And so that's a strength that seems to come with aging. Now, when I arrived at CSU, I began the Health and Daily Experiences study, which we call the HEAD study for short. I kind of like it because my lab's called the Heart Lab, so it's the head and the heart. But in this project, we were really interested in trying to disentangle and understand what are the strengths that come with aging? Things like life experience and having a better sense and understanding of things that stress us out and how to avoid them. And what are some of the vulnerabilities that come with aging? Things like cognitive and physical health issues that, there might be some tipping scales in which, sometimes older people are going to fare better and other times they might not fare so well. And so in this study, we tried to create situations that helped us better understand what those situations might be. Now, when you look in the scientific literature and the body of work that's been conducted, there are two major ways in which people tend to study stress. One is by using lab stressors. So this is where you bring participants into the laboratory and then you experimentally induce stress. So you make everybody go through the same stressful situation. Maybe you put their hand in an ice cold bucket or whatever that might be. And the reason to do this would be that you're putting everybody on the same plane, right? Because if you think about everyone's own experiences, everyone has a different kind of stressful experience in their lives. Some people are in school, some people are at work, some people are retired, and their day-to-day lives, their contexts are different. So using lab stressors allows us to put everyone on an equal plane and then observe who are the people who are getting really reactive to those stressors and who are the people who are doing just fine. And what are they doing differently in those cases? But you can also imagine that one problem with lab stressors is that they can be very artificial. So if I ask you to put your hand in an ice cold bucket, that's usually not what you would probably do in your normal day-to-day life. And so that might not feel like how you would really react to stressors in your own daily life. So another way to study stress would be to look at what we call naturalistic stressors. These are stressors that naturally unfold and occur in your day-to-day life. But you can imagine it's really challenging to understand, like, to track and follow people and figure out what kind of stressors are happening to them. And so we try to sort of combine the best of both worlds in the head study by looking at both lab and daily life stressors that people are going through. And then to understand, how do people react to these different kinds of stressors? Is it the case that a lot of what we're finding in the scientific literature and with previous studies was really what we call an artifact? That means it was a problem because a lot of these studies that found that older people are not reacting well is because they put them in these weird lab situations that they would never encounter. And so they lose that advantage of life experience dealing with familiar kinds of stressors. And of course, then this allows us to compare younger and older people in the ways that they're reacting to these different types of stressors. So in this study, we recruited, we've actually had more participants now, but at the time we had 230 participants and roughly equal numbers of younger and older adults, and also roughly equal numbers of women and men. The sample was predominantly white, but we did have a good subset of participants who identified as Hispanic or Latinx, or of some other ethnicity or race like Asian or Native American. So in general, this is what our participants did. And I know it's a lot going on the screen. So just to break it down, each of those boxes or rectangles represents a different day in the study. The most important days are the ones that are numbered, days 1 through 7. So in general, our participants were in this study for 7 consecutive days. And on each of those days, you can see they did different things. On days 1 through 7, they did something called daily life surveys. So they filled out surveys in their day-to-day life. But on days 2, 4, and 6, they did lab sessions. So they came to the CSU campus and they completed some things in the lab. And then at the very end of the study, they returned all the equipment that we loaned to them. And so I'll explain in more detail what that looks like. Now, the key thing is that on days 2, 4, and 6, we wanted to subject our participants to stressors in the lab. And not because we're sadistic and mean people, but because we really want to really understand this topic better and to understand what it's like when younger and older adults have to deal with a stressor that's very similar, but also what happens when we repeatedly subject them to this kind of stressor. And if you think about how the pandemic has dealt its toll on people, what people have had to endure, it's really the chronicity of it. It's the fact that it's enduring, it's constant, and that it was unrelenting, all the stressors that we had to experience. So we wanted to understand that adaptation process. So the stressor that we had people work with was a spontaneous public speaking task. The first time that they came into the lab, that is on day 2, we told them, hey, we would like you to do a impromptu speech. And you're going to do it in front of this panel of people who are experts on judging public speaking. You're going to be videotaped. And we'd like you to talk about your most shameful experience for the next 5 minutes. You can imagine that this is a very stressful task, and it is a standardized psychosocial stressor that has been shown to reliably elicit stressful responses. While participants were doing this task, we also had them hooked up to ECG monitors so we could look at things like their heart rate and so on while they were dealing with the task. And so they did this 3 times across the course of 1 week. We also wanted to track what participants were doing in their daily lives. And to do that, we did something called ecological momentary assessments. That's a mouthful, really, just to say that we wanted to understand people's stressful experiences in a couple different ways. One was by having them wear this Fitbit type device. So in that picture, you can see this person's wearing a black thing that looks like a watch maybe, or a Fitbit. And this is an activity monitor. It was an Empatica E4, that's the name of this monitor, but it would track things like people's heart rate, their skin conductance, which is essentially how sweaty they got in a way, and their physical activity levels. So we could look at things like, when people get stressed out, are they, going for a jog, or are they staying at home and eating a tub of ice cream? And we can also look at other things by loaning them a mobile smartphone. This phone had an app on it, a survey app, so that it would ping participants 6 times a day for 7 days. So it would kind of beep at random times, and then participants would fill out different surveys about what are they doing right now? Who are they with? What are their emotions right now? And also, had they experienced any stressors, among other things. Basically, all the data that we could get Big Brother-like, that's kind of what we got from our participants. And so we would get a really good picture of what our participants' day-to-day lives look like. And this is overlaid across, experiencing some stressful things in the lab. Now, before I show you what the data look like so far from this study, I want to start by kind of describing to you what you're about to see. So what this figure is about to show you is that you're going to see in blue are younger adults, in orange will be older adults. And in terms of positive affect reactivity, that's similar to the figure I showed you earlier, except greater negative numbers, so numbers that go down on that axis, the y-axis, that means people showed greater decreases in their positive emotions, less happiness, less joy, being less calm when they experience stressful things. On the flip side, what you'd expect to see for negative affect reactivity on the right-hand side is greater positive numbers. That means more increases in anger and frustration and sadness. So when we looked at people's reports of stressors that they experience in their day-to-day lives, so these are naturally occurring. We did not do this to our participants. This is just what they encountered in their own lives. When they said, yes, I experienced a stressor and it was interpersonal in nature, it was social, I dealt with an argument or a disagreement with someone. This is what we found. So I'm going to walk you through what this looks like. So on the left-hand side, what we see is that there's a trend in which younger people show greater dips or decreases in their positive emotions compared to older people. But when we statistically analyze it, we don't see any difference between younger and older people. However, on the right-hand side, what we do see is indeed a difference between younger and older adults. You can see that younger adults in the blue, they show greater increases in negative affect. So they're reporting more of that reactivity, that stress response when they experience these kinds of things. But look at the older adults in that orange bar, it's almost non-existent. And in fact, when you look at the older adults in the orange bars across the two types, both positive and negative affect reactivity, they do not show any difference from zero. What that means is that it kind of rolls off their shoulders. It's like, okay, it's no different. Me experiencing this interpersonal stressor is no different than on days when I don't even experience a stressor. It's just that unstressful to me. And that's super fascinating because what you can see for the younger people is it does stress them out. They show decreases in their positive emotions and increases in their negative emotions. Now, on the flip side, when we look at other kinds of stressors, more general stressors, things like, getting stuck in traffic or, having to deal with a work deadline or something like this, now we see that the pattern reverses. So here on the left-hand side, we can see that older adults in that orange bar show greater decreases in their positive emotions compared to the younger adults in the blue. That's why there's that asterisk there that shows that there is a difference between those age groups. But on the right-hand side, we see that younger and older people are about the same in how they're increasing in their negative emotions. So that age-related advantage that we see that I was showing you in that table before is consistent here in our study too. We're finding that in interpersonal situations, we think older adults are able to use their life experience and apply it to their social relationships and to be able to deal with them in ways that are less emotionally costly to them. But when it's other kinds of stressors, now we don't see that advantage anymore. And in fact, older people might be at a disadvantage in those particular cases. Now, another thing that I think is really fascinating is that a lot of these studies in the past have really focused on just a one-time experience, which means they really look at one snapshot in people's lives and assume that the way that you react to one stressor is how you react to all these other stressors in your life. And that has always been dissatisfying to me because I just don't believe that that's true. And so again, before you judge me as being too harsh and mean for subjecting people to multiple stressors across the week, this is part of the reason why we did that. So what I'm showing you here is based on some data that my graduate student, James Miller, has analyzed for us. And what you see on the y-axis is people's levels of negative affect reactivity. So again, that's how much are they increasing in their negative emotions when they experience something stressful. And like I told you, we stressed people out in the lab, making them do that public speaking task 3 times. So that's what we see on the x-axis, 1, 2, and 3. Now, younger adults and older adults, what we're seeing is that initially in that very first lab session, the first time they have to deal with this kind of wonky, weird stressor, younger people are showing more reactivity compared to older people. But what we see is that over time, the pattern flips. Now we see that younger people are adapting more quickly to this stressful situation. And older people, although they're also showing decreases in their negative affect reactivity over time, the way they're decreasing, that is older adults in that reddish orange line, are not decreasing at the same rate that younger people are. I think this has some implications for the ways that we're starting to understand and unravel the effects that the pandemic has had on us. So initially we might see that older adults are faring better, but I think as the pandemic continues to wear on, I think it's going to be an open question about whether we continue to see that older adults are doing better. It could be the case that there could be some issues here in terms of how people adapt over time. So that's one major project that we've worked on since I've come here to CSU. Another major project has been in really trying to understand a totally different kind of stressor altogether. In the head study, a lot of the stress that we tried to understand were things in the lab. And of course, we did something called debrief our participants, which means we told our participants why we did it. We gave them the opportunity to withdraw their data if they wanted to. And of course, we compensated them for being in the study. And what we were looking at in the head study were really kind of the day-to-day minutia of little smaller stressors that tend to happen to us. But what about these big hit you over the head kind of stressors? We call those major life events. What happens when something really life-changing happens to people? How do people deal with that? And so we designed a study called the Relocation and Transitional Experiences Study. It's also a mouthful, but we call it the RELATE study for short because we love acronyms in my lab. So in the RELATE study, what we really wanted to understand was a major life transition for older adults, and that is what happens when people have to get ready to move into a senior housing facility, a facility like independent living, assisted living, or a skilled nursing facility, into more institutionalized care in which they might need a little bit more assistance from nurses or other housing staff. So in these kinds of places, people tend to have a little bit less independence, and they may require more assistance. And we know that this is a pretty stressful kind of transition for a lot of people. Part of the reason why we wanted to focus on this kind of stressful experience is that there's a very clearly defined onset. We can track a time point before people have made the move and after people have made the move. And we also know that this is so stressful to a lot of people that when they make this move, they tend to experience more depressive symptoms, greater anxiety, and lower life satisfaction. And yet, despite all of this, what I think is so fascinating about aging is this concept of plasticity. Plasticity is this idea that as we gain different life experiences, our capacity for change, in fact, our capacity for growth continues to exist. And we still are able to grow despite some of the vulnerabilities or some of the declines that we might experience. And so this was really a proof of concept project for me to really understand in what ways might we be able to grow even in the face of adversity. And so really part of this project was, yes, to focus on mental and physical health. But another thing that really fascinated me was to understand in what ways might our character change. Things like our personality, but also things that help us to strive for different character strengths. Things like feeling gratitude for things that we have in life, feeling empathy for other people who go through stressful situations. When we ourselves have to go through something stressful, you can imagine that people can sort of diverge in different directions. On the one hand, people might say, gosh, I am so overwhelmed with all the stress I'm experiencing right now. I just simply cannot think about other people right now. I really have to focus on myself. And that's totally understandable. But there are also other people who, after going through something stressful, they might show greater empathy with other people. Like, gosh, now I know what it's like to go through something like that because I myself have experienced it. And so we wanted to understand these experiences more as well. And we wanted to understand different kinds of changes, whether it's state-like, like in this moment, I feel this way, versus, this is something that is changing the nature of who I am, right? My traits and my personality. And in this project, I think what was really cool about it was we understood that people make these transitions not just alone, but in a social context, that they have romantic partners and spouses, they have friends and adult children who are affected by this as well. And so we allowed our participants to nominate someone close to them to also be in the study with them, so we could understand how these processes were affecting both partners. So if you thought the other study had a lot of boxes, this one has a lot more boxes. It's a little bit of a complicated study design. It's called a prospective longitudinal measurement burst design. Again, a mouthful. But really, if you just focus on the idea that there are what we call 4 bursts of measurements, that means there were 4 time points in which we tracked our participants. And we did this over the course of approximately 3.5 months. The first burst happens, which is, we call it a burst because there's a burst of a lot of different intensive assessments, like the Fitbit type watch that we had people wear, the phones that they had, and they filled out daily life surveys, and then a bunch of questionnaires they filled out with paper and pencil or electronically. People did this 4 separate times. And this allowed us then to look at one time point prior to making that move. And then you could see that red dashed line represents when that move occurred. So if they moved into assisted living or independent living. And then we tracked them for 3 time points afterwards. And this allowed us to get a better sense and an understanding of how people are adapting over time. Remember that in the head study, I showed you that there's a flipped pattern, so that younger and older people, if it's the first time that they've encountered some weird, novel, new stressor, older people seem to be doing pretty well in those situations. But it's when you kind of hit them over the head over and over again with this stressful situation, then that pattern starts to get reversed and older people don't do quite as well. Well, in this study, we didn't have any younger adults moving into senior housing, but we wanted to understand, how are older adults making this transition and what is their adaptation like over time? So what I'm showing you here are 2 different kinds of measures that we tracked across the course of the study. And again, I have my graduate student, James Miller, to thank for analyzing these data. On the left side with the green line, what that represents is emotional well-being. That is, higher levels of happiness and joy and lower levels of negative emotions like sadness and anxiety. When you look at this pattern, it looks like there's kind of some stability and maybe a drop-off around the 4th time point. So people are showing declines. And on the right panel with the purple line, with the actigraph measure that we had, we were able to look at their physical activity, things like how many steps people took in their day-to-day lives. If you were to look at this figure, you might say, gosh, when people move into senior housing, they show declines in how much they're exercising, and they're really not that happy at all. And this is really consistent with a lot of the studies that we have seen in the past. I would say, though, unfortunately, a lot of the studies in the past were not able to really capture what people's lives were like before they made that move. And there are a lot of reasons why people might move into senior housing, but I think it's really important for us to understand some kind of baseline level to really get a better sense of what this move is doing to people. So you can see that I've purposely cut off the first time point and I haven't shown you what that is. Remember that the first time point is the assessment that happens right before they move in. This red dashed line represents when they made that move into senior housing. This is the same figure I showed you before. The only difference now is that I'm adding that first time point. So you can see what older adults were like, what their emotional well-being, and how much they exercised, or at least took steps per day, what that looked like prior to them moving into senior housing. Now we see a different pattern, and now we might tell a different story. For example, with emotional well-being, prior to making the move, people were not very happy. They're showing low levels of happiness and higher levels of negative emotions. And it's after that they move in, on average, people seem to be doing a lot better and adjusting a lot better. And the same goes for the average number of steps that people take. It's true that initially they're doing a lot of steps, and that does stave off. But even in the third and fourth waves of the study, those are still higher levels of physical activity than they were taking prior to them making that move. So I think understanding the context and where people are coming from is really important. I also want to emphasize, though, that averages mask a lot of important information. So here in this figure, what I'm about to show you is people's positive emotions or positive affect. So higher levels on the y-axis represent more happiness and joy and things like that. And on the x-axis are different time points in the study. And again, that red dashed line represents when they made that move. Now, this black horizontal line represents the average amount of positive affect that people reported in this study. You can see that on average, people did not change in their positive emotions across the 4 time points. This is the average value. If I were to show you every single person's values, though, that tells us a different story. This is what we call a spaghetti plot because it looks like you got a bunch of pasta and then threw it on a plate. And essentially what each of those different colored lines represents is a different person in the study. And this doesn't represent every single person in our study, but it gives you a good sense of what's going on. For example, down toward the bottom, you can see this blue line person. That person starts off pretty low in their positive emotions, but over time, they show increases. And yet there are other people who show declines in their positive emotions and so forth. There are a lot of different patterns here. And that's what my research team is starting to disentangle next. We want to better understand who is it that is thriving in the face of adversity and who maybe succumbs to the more stressful situations and are not able to maintain their levels of well-being. And why might that be the case? So we're looking at a variety of different issues that might lead to some of these, might shed some light on some of these factors. So I want to sort of wrap up a little bit by really emphasizing that what we have seen so far is that the ways that we understand the strengths and the vulnerabilities that come with aging really depend on a lot of different things. It depends on what kind of stressors are we looking at? What kind of timescales? Are we looking at the day-to-day things, or are we looking at big things that unfold over time? Are we looking at lab-based stressors versus stressors that are really the ones that we encounter all the time? And I think these are really important to consider because they point us into different directions about how we might want to improve people's lives and whose lives should we be focusing on. I think there's, again, a pervasive sense of a lot of stereotypes about aging, and a lot of them are negative. And yet, a lot of the work that I've been doing, and trust me, I've really tried to find different ways in which older people may not be faring so well, at least in our studies and a lot of studies that I have seen in the literature, older people seem to be faring very well. And so this suggests to us that maybe there are strengths that we can imbue into people and really teach people earlier in life when those might be times that are very challenging. And I think the pandemic has had different effects on different age groups for different reasons. You know, teenagers have had to miss out on their prom and formative years. You know, college students also missed out on, you know, meeting other people in the dorms and going to parties and socializing and forming lifelong friendships. And I think that the perspectives that older adults have taken have really been different, and that also could help as well. And I think one major take home message is that aging is not all about declines. There is so much growth that happens, and so much to offer. And I think that's why I get so excited studying aging. Sometimes I have students who ask me, you know, you're one of the youngest professors in the department, but you study one of the latest phases of the lifespan. Why is that? And I think it's really fascinating because it's something to look forward to, and it's really something that's very exciting. And I also think, given the plasticity I mentioned, right, that capacity for growth and change, that gives us some sense that there are things that we can take into our own hands and really make an effort to really change. So with that, I'd like to thank my lab, the Health, Emotion, and Aging Research Team, the HEART. I'd also like to thank those who have funded this research to make it possible. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to open it up to questions. I wasn't sure exactly how long this presentation was going to go, so I kind of kept it a little bit on the short side, but I'm also happy to share more with you if you're interested.
Thanks so much, Dr. Luong. Yeah, everyone feel free to either unmute and ask a question or pop it in the chat. Right, we got one. Can you comment on how knowing there is more plasticity than we previously thought might influence people's willingness to try new things as we age?
That's a really great question, Dr. Earhart. So yeah, it's really fascinating. Well, I think one thing is that we know about something called mindsets. So even in children, but also adults, if we have something called fixed mindsets, that means we think that something is immutable, it's unchangeable. And if we have growth mindsets, we think, gosh, you know, something might be challenging and a little hard, but we can change, we can grow. That makes a big difference because it affects our willingness and our effort to put in, you know, time and energy to make changes, exactly like what you said. And so I think the knowledge that we do see plasticity continue even through very late life and the end of life, that suggests to us that it's never too late to try to change and to grow and to find different ways to do things. Absolutely. Any other questions?
Dr. Luong, this is Lene Warden, and I'd like to know how some of this information can be used by particularly assisted living and more helpful, more supporting kinds of living situations, how those businesses, how those care areas can use this information to make the experience of their residents more fulfilling to the residents.
That's a great question, Lene. Thanks for asking that. I think there are a lot of different things that we can derive from this. So one is that initially, I think some people are, let me first say that there's a lot of diversity. Each individual is unique. And I remembered interviewing a lot of people from the Relate study. Some were very apprehensive and very skeptical and actually very unwilling to make the move. Some of it had to do with health or cognitive issues that forced them to make the move, or they had a spouse who said, you know what, we really need to do this. I can't really cook meals or take care of the house anymore. And there are other people who were really relishing it. They were like, yes, I don't have to shovel snow anymore. I don't have to, you know, take care of the yard or cook meals. I'm loving this. Everyone's different. So I think acknowledging those individual differences is a good first step. I think another point too is to understand, the reasons why people are making that move is very important, and what needs are being met by making that move. And a third that I didn't mention today, but I think is probably worth mentioning, is that although it probably sounds like I just stress people out for a living, we also do studies in which we try to help people learn ways to manage their stress a little bit more effectively. And in one partnership that we have with Columbine Health Systems, we have been teaching people something called mindfulness techniques. Mindfulness is this idea that we can try to be non-judgmental and aware in the present moment. And that kind of mindset has been shown to help people reduce the amount of stress they have. For example, let's say you get upset about something happening to you. You blew up at a colleague or a friend. And now you're thinking about that situation. And now you're mad about the way that you got mad in that situation, right? We make judgments about the ways that we do things. And then we get into these spirals. Mindfulness helps people to accept what they did and to move on, but also, to try to grow and learn to do things better. And so we partnered up with Columbine Health Systems and other senior housing facilities in Northern Colorado to help teach residents some of these strategies. And the data are still very preliminary, so we haven't had a chance to really thoroughly look through it. But I think that the initial results are promising, that these offerings can be very helpful in terms of understanding, this kind of these sorts of ways to have concrete strategies to deal with stressful situations, and acknowledging, that this is a big move for people, and providing compassionate care in that regard. The other takeaway, I know this wasn't what you asked, Lene, but the other takeaway from that project, the Compassionate Community Actively Living Mindfulness, or CALM project, is that we also taught the healthcare staff at these senior housing facilities the mindfulness techniques as well. And that is because we understand that stress can be interactive, right? It can spill over. If an older resident is having a really hard time making that adjustment, that can, translate into not treating a nurse very nicely, or, getting upset with, a staff member for various reasons. And so we've also taught staff members about this, and some of the initial results too are also promising and suggest that investing in healthcare staff and teaching them different ways to manage their stress too can also influence the ways and how they provide care to the older adult residents. That's a great question, Lene. Sorry, I went on a tangent there.
All right, and then Kathleen asked, I was wondering, if older adults are less reactive to interpersonal stressors, why would older adults choose to decrease the number of their more distant relationships, or the socio-emotional selectivity theory?
Yeah, so are you asking about if they're better at it, why decrease the number of social contacts in the first place? I think that was the question, right? Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, yes. So for those of you who might not be aware of this theory, there's a theory called socio-emotional selectivity theory. Again, a mouthful because we just love these theories. This is a theory that suggests that what makes humans a little bit unique and different from other creatures is that we have an awareness that we are mortal beings, that we will die someday. And so we have a limited amount of time that we're here on Earth. And so what this theory suggests is, as we get older and we start to become more and more aware that we have limited time left to live, we then begin to reprioritize our goals. We change the ways that we live our lives, and then we focus more and more on the things that matter to us. And if I were to pose it this way, if you knew you only had 1 week left to live, what would you do with that week? Would you spend it doing your 40-hour-a-week job? Or would you spend it spending time with loved ones and doing activities that are fun and meaningful to you? Right? And if you thought you had 30 years left to live, then you'd live your life very differently. And so according to this theory, as we get older, we realize, gosh, we don't have as much time left to live. What do I want to do with my life? What do I want to leave behind as my legacy? And so people change that by focusing more on emotionally and socially meaningful goals. And they do that in part by, according to this theory, cutting out people in their lives who just are not worth it. Right. So this could be, the annoying neighbor that you don't really want to talk to anymore, or a long lost relative who is really always bringing up, controversial political issues. And so we know actually that our social networks do shrink as we get older. This begins to happen even in our 20s, and it continues throughout our adult lifespan. However, when we look at the composition of our networks and what changes, it tends to be more peripheral partners, people who are not super close to us. And it's the close ones, the people who are part of our core network, who travel with us in a convoy kind of model. So, so the question from Kathleen was, why is it that older adults even try to prune out these people from their networks if they're so good at avoiding conflict? Well, cutting people out of your network, people think, is one really good way to avoid having that conflict ever, if you don't ever talk to them anymore. And although older people might be pretty good at avoiding conflict, what's really fascinating is that there's a study from the National Study of Daily Experiences, which is a study of thousands of US participants. And it shows that even when people said, I could have gotten into an argument today, but I walked away from it, that was still stressful for people, just as stressful in some ways as actually getting into a full-blown argument with people. So just knowing that you had to walk away from an argument and, kind of manage the situation in different ways is quite stressful. So if you can cut someone out of your life, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, but if you cut certain people out of your lives, that actually might be quite adaptive. And not to go on this long tangent, but my colleagues and I published a paper a couple years ago that showed that older adults who tend to have very conflictual networks, like if you have a lot of people in your life who really bring you down and really get into arguments a lot with you and disagree with your views and values, older people who spend less time with those individuals tended to be quite happier in the form of having less anger and frustration and sadness. And so although that might seem super obvious, I think that's worth mentioning because we sometimes get the sense, or we're told messages like, don't spend time alone, you shouldn't be alone, try to spend time with other people. And I would say the quality matters. The quality of our networks might be more important than the quantity, the number of people we hang out with. Thanks for that question, Kathleen.
Great. Is there a problem with something like a survivorship bias when studying older people? Or what is meant is older people look like they adapt better, but only those that adapt well get old.
That's a fantastic question. And yes, I think that's one possibility. And it's very challenging to tease apart. A lot of the studies that we do are what we call cross-sectional, which means we compare some group of younger people to older people. And even if we wanted to track people over the course of decades to see what they look like as they get older, a lot of us researchers will die before our participants will. So there are some really excellent longitudinal studies that also sort of track these differences. And part of it could be a survivorship issue. Part of it, though, however, looks like with longitudinal studies, so when you're even able to track people across the decades, we do see a similar pattern in which as we get older, we do tend to get a little happier, right? Our emotional well-being seems to increase. People report being less neurotic, and people also report fewer of these problematic issues in their relationships. It's a great question.
Wonderful. This is related to the HEAD study. Does the lack of differences in response to interpersonal stressors in everyday life in older adults result from a larger number of familiar contacts? For example, knowing how to handle or / take them, or would it be the same with a larger number of unknown distant contacts?
That's a fantastic question. We know that as people get older, their networks shrink, like I mentioned, and people tend to interact with fewer numbers of different people. So as you were saying, these people tend to be more familiar to them. I think it could be a combination of things. I think on the one hand, that's a benefit because if we are interacting with the same people we know really well, we know what pushes their buttons and we know to avoid it. We also know how they can push our buttons. We know like when a partner is about to say or bring up a topic that's just a big no-no in the relationship, like for the millionth time, can you please put the toilet seat down? We know that there are certain topics to just avoid because it's not going to go anywhere. And I think that helps, that there are situations in which we know how to navigate them, and then they kind of become so familiar that we don't have to deal with them in quite the same way, or they're not as this big deal anymore. I think it's a fascinating open question about how people would deal with a lot of interactions with people they're not as familiar with because they lose some of that advantage. Some work would suggest that older people don't derive quite the same amount of emotional value from strangers, let's say. And so some of this might have a lot to do with, yeah, interacting with people we know really well. It's a great question.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful information, which has been echoed in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, how does this study compare with the studies in other countries?
Yeah, super great questions. We are very US centric here. So yes, a lot of my studies are focused on the US. But as Ali mentioned earlier, I did my postdoc in Berlin in Germany. And so there I had a chance to work with some data with German participants. And we see a very similar pattern there too, that as people age, we're seeing greater increases in emotional well-being. And there are some really interesting findings emerging from those data that suggest that, yeah, for example, maybe another reason why older people might be really motivated to have really emotionally meaningful experiences is not just because they have this impending doom of like, my life is going to end relatively soon, but also there's an understanding perhaps that our emotions are pretty tied to our physical health, and that by taking care of one, we're taking care of the other as well. So in our that German data set, we're starting to see some support for those findings. So we see that there. I'm also aware of some similar findings in Hong Kong, China as well. So I'm sure there are exceptions, but of the data that I'm aware of, we're starting to see that it is pretty consistent. But these are, of course, countries that tend to be more industrialized and wealthier and tend to include more educated participants. So I think it's an open question what it might look like in other countries. Great question.